All right, the logical place to start is with the Constitution. So, in the days after Mao, we see the Chinese government institute a Constitution 1982. And unlike what we see with liberal democracies, where constitutions attempt to divide power and provide checks and balances so that nobody can assume all the power, in these kinds of regimes, authoritarian regimes, we see the opposite. You see a constitution give all of the power to one entity, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party. However, it gives the appearance of creating democracy. And so now, if you look at China, you'll see legislatures, you'll see courts, you'll see presidents, but it's what we call illiberal democracies. Democracy on the surface, democracy for looks, but in reality, authoritarian.
China has a authoritarian oligarchy. So they are an authoritarian regime, which means there are limited freedoms, limited rights for people. You do have elections to some degree, but mainly the country is ruled by a small group of people. In this case, the Politburo, which is a very high level of the Chinese Communist Party. Their ideology is no longer stone cold communism like it was in the era of Mao Zedong, but instead a relaxed form of communism. Still communist principles for sure, but a lot of other, capitalistic and democratic elements mixed in. The economy is a socialist market economy, and it's not easy to put your finger on exactly what the Chinese are doing with their economy. They do have a lot of traditional command economy controls, but on the other hand, they have various cities that have been unleashed to be free market economies. Even in the overall economies, a lot of elements have been changed in recent years to make them more competitive on the global markets as well. So we'll see how that plays out in a moment too. When it comes to legitimacy and stability, you kind of have to do a historical timeline, because right now things are pretty stable because the economy is thriving and restrictions have been reduced. People are allowed to be a little more free these days. But historically, there's plenty of examples of instability and people being upset. And automatically people will probably think Tiananmen Square back in 1989 as some of the people rising up against the authoritarianism of the Chinese government. But you also have to kind of look at the traditional Confucian background of Chinese culture, at least with the Han Chinese. And that is that there's always been this expectation, going back to ancient times, that people accept their role in society. You play your role, whether it be in society, in the workforce, in the family. And for most people, that means being subservient to an authority. And so, on the whole, Chinese people as citizens in the nation tend to feel themselves to be subservient to the state. And so lots of strong leaders over the years and a very much subdued society for the most part. Again, there have been historical uprisings at various points. But most citizens agree that this is the way it should be. And this is a deeply seated Confucian tradition that makes it that way. And so things in China usually are stable. Legitimacy is always definitely in the communist era, in the post-communist era, there was a respect and a granting of authority to the state. And so that makes it very legitimate. It's obviously legitimate externally, and times are relatively stable at this juncture for China. China has a unitary government through and through. Some regions have been giving autonomy, such as Hong Kong, who basically administers itself. But all the authority, the true authority, rests in the national government at the top. However, it is also still kind of rooted in this old tradition of the Soviet Union and communism, where we have a hierarchy. So the name of the game about the levels of government for China is a hierarchy. And so therefore, what we see is if you want to climb the ladder of Chinese government, you basically have to do so by starting out at the local level, at the township level, and then you try to engage in a series of promotions. And you move up to the county level or the provincial level, the city level, all the way up to the National People's Congress. You have to work your way up, and that's the only way. In other words, you can't get directly elected to the National Congress. You have to work your way up through the hierarchy. There is a degree of democracy in China, but there's not really what we would call national elections. They only instead select members at the lowest levels. And at that point, you enter into the hierarchy. And if you are a serious player in politics, you can promote yourself or be promoted all the way up the ladder to the top. All other congresses are filled with delegates from one level down. So again, you work your way up from the township to the county to the city to the provincial. The level below feeds the people who are above, and then the people who are above were formerly in the level below. The head of state is the president of China, who in this case has mostly ceremonial powers, but does have a degree of authority. The real power in China is the premier, who is the head of government. This person is appointed by and from the National People's Congress. So from amongst this large group of people, one person is kind of pulled out to be the premier, and then they also head the State Council, which is basically the Chinese cabinet. As in parliamentary systems, most legislation drawn up by specialists under the supervision of the State Council. So the same thing that we see in Great Britain, for example, where the policy agenda is set by the cabinet, in China the State Council, and then it is sent over to the legislature to be modified, crafted, amended, and then eventually approved. The legislature in China is called the National People's Congress, and it has delegates that serve 5-year terms and assemble annually for about 2 weeks. And so a little bit different than what we might see in Western legislatures where they're more or less full-time. But 3,000 members, which sounds like a lot, but you got to remember there's 1.5 billion people in China. So actually they have a much smaller proportion of representation than there are in other countries. The National People's Congress can amend the Constitution, pass and amend legislation, approve budgets, confirm leaders, do all the things that a typical legislature does. However, we have to remember who's really in charge here, and that is the Communist Party of China. And so what you're really seeing in the National People's Congress is that they are what we call a rubber stamp. Whatever is fed to them, they may go through the appearance of being a mindful legislature where they're really working hard to enact the best policy possible. No, they're really there just to stamp it approved. They may go through the democratic motions and for the public and all that, but really they're just there to approve what it has been told to do by the Communist Party. And, occasionally it becomes authoritative and bold and resists what the party wants to do. But you also have to remember that a lot of people, just about everybody who serves in the National People's Congress, are also Communist Party members. So it's not like we're talking about two different entities here. As we'll see, in China, people wear two hats. They serve in the party in some capacity, and they also serve in the government in some capacity. So 73% of the NPC's delegates are party members, as I was just saying. And the party makes nominations to be confirmed by the National People's Congress, and it's always one option. So again, when we're talking about the legislature approving personnel, well, you have been given one option and you really have no other choice. And so this is what was created by the 1983 Constitution. It creates this democratic-looking National People's Congress, but it's really a facade to make citizens believe that they have some kind of democratic system, when in reality it's an authoritarian system that makes all the decisions in the party system and then feeds it to the legislature to be rubber-stamped. Again, there is no electoral system in China that fits the molds that we have set up already. Only elections at the local level, which I couldn't tell you anything about how they work. But there are no regional elections and there are no national elections. You get elected at the local level, and then you get promoted up through the ranks through that system. And so now we turn our attention to the party. And if you see that diagram that was a few slides earlier, you'll see that the structure of the party is also hierarchical, and it more or less parallels the hierarchy that culminates in the National People's Congress. So we have a party Congress inside the political party. So the Communist Party Constitution vests supreme authority in the National Party Congress. So all the members that don't have elite positions are members of the Party Congress. And right now, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 delegates. They meet every 5 years. Similar to what Republicans and Democrats in the United States do, they meet every 4 years to adopt a party platform. However, in China, it's a much bigger deal because whatever the party decides in those every 5-year meetings to set up their platform, they more or less are establishing their policy agenda that they're going to push through the National People's Congress. If you move up, if you prove to be a true party player and prove your competence, your willingness to be a team player, you can move your way up to the next level in the party, which is the Central Committee. Here, we only have 200 members. They meet once a year to approve government personnel, and which is to say they have the vetting process to winnow down personnel to be approved. Remember, the approval by the NPC is only one option. So that one option they're getting is coming from the Central Committee. Members usually hold positions of power in the government, such as cabinet ministers. So if you are a member of the Communist Party Central Committee, you probably are also serving at the high levels of the cabinet or upper levels in the People's Congress, or maybe even other things. If you prove to be an even more elite party player, then you can move up to the Politburo. So this is the oligarchy that administers China to this very day. So delegates from the Central Committee can move up to the Politburo, 24 members in this case, and from amongst those 24 members, they choose the party general secretary. Each member of the Politburo oversees a specific area, so they all are experts in various fields. And then in 1982, they changed the title of the party chairman, which is kind of synonymous with Chairman Mao, who's now got baggage after his death, and people will kind of want to do some reforms and move in a new, open direction. So they abolished that title, and then we get the general secretary to kind of promote more of a dynamic of leadership rather than dictatorship. Elite recruitment, this should be very obvious to you. How do you become an elite in China? Well, you got to work your way up the nomenclatura system, or the name list. Obviously, you have to be a major Communist Party player. If that's true, then you're also going to be a major player in the governmental system. But from where do you have to come from to be able to do that? Well, these days, Chinese elites tend to be intellectuals, or technocrats, as sometimes they're called, which are highly educated experts in a certain area, professionals, private entrepreneurs, which is kind of ironic. The elites in the Communist Party are oftentimes free market trained people. And so, again, with China, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have a strong, authoritative, sharp party and government structure, but at the same time want to have a booming economy and all the bells and whistles that go with it. And so they do that by the personnel that they promote through the ranks. When we look at the bureaucracy, we really see it on full display with China, in that it is a bureaucratic state. Large government, lots of government controls, in the past a command economy with the communist ideology. And so naturally there's a very substantive bureaucracy. And also with the military, you have a very mighty presence with the People's Liberation Army. And so this is one of the largest militaries in the world. They play a major role in Chinese politics, especially in the region. Go and ask Taiwan or Japan how uneasy they are about the presence of China, not to mention North Korea and Russia, who are also in the neighborhood, and it definitely can be nerve-wracking. But if we look at historical development of the People's Liberation Army, back in the days of Mao, they were the main apparatus through which the Cultural Revolution was unleashed, and they would go in very much like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or the FSB in Russia, and go down and put down demonstrations, take out intellectuals that are promoting Western ideas or anti-government ideals. And so they've historically been in the center of a lot of major events, sometimes not so pretty events. Today, they devote a lot of energy to preventing Taiwan's independence. And if you get into that whole debate, is Taiwan, which is where the nationalists fled after the Civil War in the aftermath of World War II, are they independent, which they believe themselves to be, or are they rightfully part of China? And so the Army has always got a watchful eye on Taiwan, making sure they're not exercising their perceived independence too much on the global stage. The judiciary is called the Supreme People's Court, and it too is hierarchical. You have various courts that exist below it. All courts are responsible to the Congress at their level. So any issue that shows up at the local level, well, then the local courts will deal with it. Regional government issues will be adjudicated at the regional courts, and of course, the Supreme Court will handle things at the top. Also, they take direction from the courts above them, so there is authority of the People's Supreme Court over all courts below it. Regional courts have authority over local courts, and so on. Here's the thing about the Chinese court system. It more or less is a joke. It's also a rubber stamp, just like the National People's Congress is. Again, the Communist Party is calling the shots here, and so if they have an agenda to get through, and somebody hangs it up on legal grounds, the judiciary is not going to do much to stop it. And again, it also goes along with this facade of the Chinese government appearing to be a democratic system, and that's why they call it the People's Court. And so, just like the National People's Congress is a way to make it seem like the Communist Party's agenda is more democratic, the judiciary does the same thing. It gives the appearance that the law is dissected, adjudicated fairly, that people get to voice their grievances against the law, people's rights are being observed and protected, but it's all not really happening. It's all for show. Now, the Supreme People's Procuratorate is in the business of exposing corruption. Again, with the government, you're not going to see a whole lot done. You'll get the appearances of it, but not really too much there. You may see some things in the private sector that they address, but the judiciary is notoriously corrupt, notoriously weak, and it continues to be that to this very day. In the Maoist years, there was no rule of law, and it was basically the Mao law. It was the way things were. But then when he dies, reforms were immediately instituted, and so they tried to get a criminal code to promote legitimacy and fairness and consistency in sentencing and the way crimes were prosecuted. But in that attempt, which was a noble attempt, corruption has kind of hampered it ever since. Like I said, there's a lot of corruption in the legal system when it comes down to punishing people that are questioning the Chinese Communist Party too much. They have tons of political prisoners. Media people, journalists who question the government get thrown in prison. You never hear from them again. And some of them we know about, and you'll see the West commentate on the political prisoners that we know of in the prisons of China. And we call upon China to release them, and then it's a big international saga. But the criminal proceedings are not innocent until proven guilty. They're very inquisitorial, which means you're guilty until you can prove that you're not. And for all the advances that China has enacted in the last generation or so, their courts sadly lag pretty far behind. In China, we have a corporatist system of interest groups. And again, this means that there are interest groups, but they're basically fronts for the government to try to indoctrinate the people. It doesn't voice the opinions of the people toward the government. It works the other way than it does in pluralist systems. And we use the term NGOs, non-government organizations. And those that do exist are linked somehow to environmentalism, usually, trying to protect species or conversation, and environmental education, because they're at the point now where they are seeing the environmental impacts of their industrial output that they've been focusing on for so long. And so NGOs tend to be arms of the government in China. However, people do seek to have their interests articulated for the government to hear. And in China, this is mainly through patron-client networks, what we might call traditionally in America patronage or deal-making, votes for money or jobs or something like that, all the way down to simple things like bribery. In China, it's called guanxi, which is, people doing those kinds of things to make ends meet, special favors and whatnot, to try to get an extra little bit in society to reach their goals and make ends meet. Let's take a look at political culture now. And we have a very interesting connection between the nation and the state in China. And one concept we need to look at is the mass line. And so the Chinese Communist Party, again, embodies this traditional Confucian position that they are the authority, it's their role to play, to be the guardians of the best interest of the country, or the people's democratic dictatorship. Dictatorship, not necessarily a dirty word in China. It just simply means that they're playing their role. But at the same time, you have to be a realist, and you have to understand that people in the nation need to have their ideas heard. They need to vent a lot of times, because it's just like something that gets pressurized. If you let it get pressurized and don't give it any venting, it's going to explode. And so the mass line is a way to do that. And so there are very controlled ways for people to vent their so-called scattered ideas. And this may be allowing them to write letters to the editors or to demonstrate in a very controlled environment. A lot of the same stuff happens in Russia. And so that allows the people to speak their minds, to feel like they've articulated their interests. And then the belief amongst the elites in the Communist Party is to correct those ideas. It's one thing to let them vent, but if you don't correct them and set them on the path toward understanding why we do things the way we do, then all that's going to do is to ferment into unrest. And so this is why they call it this two-way, from the masses to the masses. Let the masses talk and then give it back to them and guide them down the path that the government wants them to go down. This is the mass line. Very few Chinese people tend to reject notions of democracy. Again, for a very long time, they've held an authoritarian view based on their traditional teachings. However, if we go to other places like Taiwan and Hong Kong, then they're a little more favorable to democracy because they've been exposed to it more than the rest of China. How do people get their opinions? Again, Confucianism and their teachings on authority and playing your role in society. And with any authoritarian state, you're going to get a lot of indoctrination via TV and radio for elderly or older people and for education for the young. Mainly men, the educated and the wealthy, are the ones that are familiar with what's going on in the news. But things are changing because, again, it's social media, the internet, satellite TV, are especially those in the proximity of Hong Kong, are allowing people to see even more Western ideas than they ever have. And I think the Chinese authorities, the state has recognized this and gone with it a little bit. And this is why we see a little bit more democratization, a little bit more of a free market, relaxing of tensions. They're going through the same thing that Russia did at the end of the Soviet Union, glasnost, perestroika. They're going through their own versions of that now, and so they've done a very crafty job of from the masses to the masses, controlling how people absorb information, going with it, shifting it when it needs to happen, to a very successful degree. It's very impressive how how the citizenry has been socialized in a very controlled way. Political participation, guardianship of the party renders most citizen participation unnecessary. The state does things for the people, and the people don't see that as being stifled. They see that as that's the way it's supposed to work. It's the way it's always worked here in China. But again, people have their ways of voicing opinions. Talked about this a minute ago. They could write letters to the newspapers. There are local elections now. But there are things that have been cracked down on. For example, back in the 80s, it was very common for people to do big character posters, which is, not all that far away from, political graffiti or something. But that has been deemed unacceptable participation, as are strikes, mass protests. These things have been banned, but ironically have increased as people have become more open to Western ideas. When unrest does happen, it's usually because of local corruption and unfairness and cronyism than it is about big, national or policies that we around here in the United States we tend to get fired up about that stuff more. 3 major mass demonstrations have exploded in the 70s and 80s. Again, I mentioned Tiananmen Square. All of these were people standing up against what they felt was too much authority for the state. All ended in failure, which is why things continued the way they have always been, maybe modified a bit, but the same party has been in power for quite some time. The civil society is where we got some issues. Things don't tend to fit. The civil society is gradually emerging. Reform and opening, the relaxing of the tensions, more free market, more capitalism, and more democracy have been emerging slowly but surely and steadily since the death of Mao. But it is still weak, both by force and by tradition. And people have not yet come around to the realization that they could demand more. They could voice their opinions more. It may get ugly, but they haven't really got to that point yet. It's slowly happening, and some groups have embraced that. But we do have elements of a civil society, of art and music and cinema that are incredibly impressive when it comes to the expression of people outside of the government. Again, you can't go that far. Any authoritarian regime, it doesn't go that far. But for an authoritarian regime, or quasi one, the civil society is actually a little more developed than you might expect. Religion is a very interesting concept in China, and it very much is part of the civil society, since for citizens there is no religion. For foreigners, they are allowed to practice, and there's lots of foreigners in China. They are allowed to practice at will. However, they're not allowed to proselytize, which is to spread their religion. But even for citizens, they're getting really loose on the enforcement here, as long as you're not a troublemaker. And there's house churches and house worship services and things where on the underground where people are doing their thing, and the authorities know about it, and they're not quite so quick to crack down anymore. But if you start getting out in society and making a fuss and making a spectacle, then they are going to crack down on you. And the group that illustrates this the most is Falun Gong, which is this mystical group that will go into public squares and all on cue drop down and start praying in unison and meditating. And then the authorities are all scrambling around looking foolish, trying to arrest everybody. And so that kind of stuff will get you cracked down on. Islam, like in many places, is infiltrating into the country and being practiced by more and more people, in this case by non-Han Chinese. And so we've got a lot of people from Central Asia and other places that are bringing in more and more expression of Islam, and most notably the Uyghurs, who are in northeastern China. And Now, just like in a lot of places, there's growing tension with Islam's introduction into a society that traditionally hasn't had it. The media is, again, we have an authoritarian regime, and so therefore it's very much controlled. But like I said before, it's becoming harder for the Chinese government to monitor outside media outlets coming from Hong Kong or from the BBC, social media, radio, TV, newspaper. All these things are steadily flooding into the country, even though they do their best to regulate the internet. I've had friends in China who say it's very difficult for things like Facebook and other social media because it's heavily controlled and censored by the government. But they can't get everything, and there's always back ways to get things in and out media-wise. Most outlets don't discuss politics, but the government still reserves the right to censor them since they're state-controlled. But there is going to be subtle indoctrination, and it's going to be a source of socialization for people's politics, those who do follow it. On the other hand, investigative reporting has exploded over the last 10 years. Many people have gone to prison who have been a little too vocal about criticizing the government, and much has been made in the international press and in foreign relations for both countries between them and China, calling for their release, calling for a change in their capital punishments, in their prison terms and sentences. And this is something that China hasn't really budged on lately. And it goes to the territory of an authoritarian regime. You speak up, you could very well have bad things happen to you, or at the very least not have people hear from you for a very long time. And so China is again dealing with more relaxed imposition of these of various things, but at the same time they're only going to tolerate it to a level. When you start criticizing the government and weakening the impact of the government and its authority, then you're going to be dealt with. Even though we have a country that is overwhelmingly Han Chinese, we still have a lot of cleavages, a lot of sources of tension. Hong Kong coming back into the possession of China after being part of Great Britain for so long really has I think it was much more about worry and fear of the unknown for the Chinese government than how it has really turned out. But it's been more intangible things that they've been worried about. And so Hong Kong, again, being more of a democratic free market tradition that it came from, the Chinese government feared that it would come in and promote all these things in mainland China. And it really hasn't happened that way. The deal was that they would be allowed to have self-rule and continue these things, but obviously the government didn't want that to flood into the rest of China. And so after it turned over, really none of these things have happened. But what they weren't counting on was the media influence. And also, in terms of the economy, some things have, Hong Kong's market has impacted Chinese markets to a degree as well. So there is some tension there. I don't think it's as much as everyone expected, but there is some stuff there. Taiwan and Tibet. Since World War II, China has threatened to annex Taiwan, which is the nationalist that fled to this Formosa. Very few people or few countries recognize it as a sovereign state. In the early going, most of the Western nations did, but in the course of the Cold War, they became a little more reluctant to do that. And today, very few recognize it as a sovereign country. And so Tibet themselves feel like they are independent. China believes that they are part of the rest of the country. Tibet is very much struggling to separate from China since being taken over in 1951. And then again, they kind of have their own rogue identity. And of course, the Dalai Lama is there. It's a huge Buddhist center. And they basically want to be left alone, and China won't allow that to happen for various reasons. And so you hear about it every now and then. We have these humanitarian aid commercials or concerts where a bunch of rock stars will perform to aid Tibet with a bunch of concert goers who have no idea what's going on with Tibet. And so those have been sources of tension in the country as well. On a more day-to-day basis, religion is becoming a increasingly an intense situation for Chinese authorities, both with groups like Falun Gong and some Christians who are expressing themselves openly in society, and also Islam, places like Xinjiang, which is almost overwhelmingly Muslim Uyghurs who are basically being unabashed about their expression, and this is something very new for China. They haven't had a whole lot of intrusion from Islamic groups before, and so definitely a source of tension there. And then the last thing with China is that it is very much there are two Chinas. You could articulate this in many ways. But there's a rural China that it's almost living in the Middle Ages still, and then the advanced industrial big cities of China in the eastern part of the country that are very advanced. And the rural areas are tending to fall behind the cities, and so there's that division there. Furthermore, because China is so big, and then you have these rural areas that are way out, far away from the national authorities, the Communist Party, you get local emperors, little emperors, who are kind of ruling things at the village level. And so on the one hand, the locals don't like it because of oppression, and the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like it because this is somebody trying to steal their authority. And so you got lots of problems with the economic and political problems on terms of city versus rural. Obviously, since China's been around for so long, you're going to have a lot of amazing historical stories. The founding of the People's Republic of China, we'll start there. And this happens in 1911. Imperial China had long been ruled by an emperor and gave us things like the meritocracy based on Confucian teachings, which is still employed in many places in the West today. The last dynasty, which is the Qing dynasty, fell in 1911. It's actually a movie, a Jackie Chan movie made about it called 1911. And two factions emerged, the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. And they started fighting each other and began in 1927. But then in 1937, the Japanese invaded and committed all kinds of atrocities during that time and all throughout World War II. The United States, of course, had been an ally of Chiang Kai-shek at the time. And basically, they all kind of bound together to fight off the Japanese. And once that happened, they went back to fighting each other after the war. Ultimately, the communists win, the nationalists flee to Taiwan, and the Mao era of Chinese communism begins. The first major agenda item for Mao was to basically be little brother to the Soviet Union. This was called lean to one side. And this goes on for the first decade or so of the Chinese communist experiment after 1949, and they joined a treaty with Russia, did all the same things that Stalin had done, which is develop heavy industry, centralized bureaucracy, 5-year plans, collectivization, nationalization, you name it, basically the whole communist game plan. What followed was kind of the falling out of Mao with the Soviet Union, and he started to employ his own version of the communist game plan, his own unique plan. This is called the Great Leap Forward, and it basically ran throughout the 60s. And it was a lot of the same stuff. I mean, communes, it was also a Soviet thing, but this was the grouping of thousands of families, and literally communes too, where people were multiple families living in the same small area, but they basically became the main political and economic unit of the country. And we see a lot of the same things that happened with that in the Soviet Union, which is the peasantry really takes a beating. They're exhausted to death. 27 million are going to die during this era, and of course there were denials and all kinds of things about what really happened. Well, we saw the exact same thing in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And so basically Mao is becoming his own Stalin now, to the point where he almost kind of loses it. Many people look back and at the time are saying that he kind of lost his marbles a bit, and that kind of climaxes with the Cultural Revolution that happens in the mid-60s. And this is where Mao calls in the Red Guard to wipe out the the Western people, the people who are advocating those ideas throughout the Communist Party and in the universities, and they went in and did all kinds of ugly things to these people. They called them struggle sessions, which is the euphemism of torturing people who were opponents of Mao or advocating Western ideals or anti-government positions or whatever it may be. And by the time of 1967, the whole country was in anarchy, and it was really not looking too good in China. In fact, they lost a lot of ground to the other world powers at the time. You didn't really hear from them again for a while, at least on the global stage. Then Mao dies in 1976, and within a couple of years, the modernizers gained control of the country, and that shortly thereafter is when we saw the 1982 Constitution be put into place, and the beginnings of the new China started to emerge. When we fast forward to today, never since the 80s or so, we've seen China unleashing its new self. And we might encapsulate it in terms of the agenda of reform and opening, kind of the Chinese version of glasnost and perestroika. And so their biggest goal is to foster economic development. The leadership in China after Mao realized that there was no reason why they couldn't be a global economic power because of everything that they had. And they realized also that the command economy had been proven to be not the best thing to do by the Soviets, and how they had lost ground to the West and the United States. And China basically took that signal wisely and said, we could do so much more with the free market. At the same time, they didn't want to lose their authoritarian control from the Communist Party. So they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And they've been remarkably successful to this point in doing so. And so what they did was kind of play it both ways. They maintained, by and large, a lot of communist and command economy ideals, but at the same time, they created these special economic zones, which would basically these capitalist utopias. It's almost like they built a fence around certain areas and said, inside these areas, go nuts. You're a full-fledged capitalist. And that way they let the market dictate development and production and all these things. And basically they unleashed incredible output. And that's what's feeding China's economy. They're the world's second largest economy, 10% a year a few years ago. And they're hitting the skids a little bit recently, but still very much a thriving economy. Per capita still very low because they have so much poverty in rural areas. But, incredible what they've done economically. Farms have been decollectivized into different functions. Now they call them Township Village Enterprise, or TVEs, which are local and private-run agriculture. So again, they kind of play it both ways. They've turned over control from the national government to more effective administration by the TVEs, and even allowed a free market agricultural sector to be unleashed. They've also kind of done a lot of the other things that Gorbachev did in the Soviet Union, which be more transparent, allow people to move a little more freely, engage in global affairs and foreign investment a lot more, and obviously going the other way too, investing in for example, the United States bond market. And they do all of this to the degree to maximize economic output, but at the same time not compromise the authority or power that the Chinese Communist Party has. And so, this is why they've done things the way they've done it. They are not all that concerned about environmental issues. They're not all that concerned about social issues or cultural issues. Their main goals are as much economic output as we can without compromising political power. So the policy challenges that China faces are plentiful. So with economic challenges, again, you have that balance that they're trying to strike. But many theories tell us that as a country moves into advanced industrialization, and even more so with a capitalist industrial society, you're going to have effects like a wealth gap is going to grow. You're going to see separation between the cities and the rural areas. and we talked about some of these cleavages that have developed. They are now entering into the global community a lot more in order to attract more foreign investment. But at the same time, the more global you become, the more scrutinized you become for your shortcomings. Things like their judicial system or their environmental issues or their one-child policy, as we'll see in a moment. So that's, again, a balancing act they're trying to strike. Socially, civil liberties are still pretty restricted. I mean, this is still classified as an authoritarian regime. And they're growing slowly, but not enough to challenge the communist government. Again, we'll let you have civil liberties as long as we can maintain Communist Party authority. The environment is really becoming a detriment to them because of the environmental damage. You can go to major cities in China and see the smog in the air right in front of your face. And they do all kinds of things to address that, but they can make it rain and to try to clean up the air. But again, they'll talk a big talk about addressing the environment, but they're not really going to do much if it threatens industrial output. So their whole mantra is first development, then environment. And down the road, maybe they get to the point where they do address some of the staggering cost of pollution. Not only the economic issues, 8 to 12% of the GDP is spent on addressing the pollution problem, but then also, of course, the health issues that go along with it. And so it's again a balancing act when it comes to environmental policy. Socially, one of the big things that always comes up is the one-child policy, which began in 1978. And it's actually in the Constitution. And in this case, families are required to stop childbearing after 1 or 2 births, depending on the area that you're in. And then sterilization is required from one of the parents, which is so backwards and so primitive, something that you would find in previous centuries. But they felt like it was the only possible way to get their enormous population issue under control. And so the way it works is a second child is permitted if the first one is a girl. So they are looking for more males. And of course, this creates a girl shortage, because if you have a boy in your first child, then you don't go for a second child, and there's no chance to get a girl. And so there's a girl shortage in China. But of course, this is all very barbaric, very old world. And so the international community has been really letting them have it over the last generation. But there are incentives attached to it, and most Chinese families do kind of play along because they want to get all the perks that go with it. If you comply, then you get better school admissions, increased health care, other government incentives. At the end of the day, the West is going to see this as a barbaric policy, but you also need to look at the outputs and say, did it do what it was intended to do, which is to slow down the population growth, which you can see the bottom line there, from 500 million to 1.5 billion in just 2 generations, which is staggering growth. And so, I guess you say that it has been a success, and it has been relaxed in recent years a little bit more, but still very much a blemish on the social policy record of China. And then foreign policy. China is constantly in mild conflict with many entities, Japan and others around North Korea, in that neighborhood of the world. They do want to be the authoritative power in the region. And they also do a lot with the United States. Most of the time, trade deals and business deals go down with the United States and are relatively, organized and everybody kind of walks away happy. The United States gets to have its cheaply made products in China, which means we ship a lot of jobs and production plants over there. They like to borrow or buy a lot of our debt, which is more of a national security problem for the United States than it is for them. When we say that we have nearly $20 trillion or more in debt in the United States, well, the Chinese government is the one who owns a lot of that debt. And if they ever decide that they want to be repaid for that debt more quickly than, or they sell off their bonds, then we've got a real problem on our hands, because there's no way we could possibly pay that. So, like I said, China is inviting more international investment. They're slowly integrating into the global community as the years have gone by. But the paradox of that is more scrutiny, and so they're always going to temper it down in order to maintain authority.